My name is Chuck Smythe, and I'm Director of the History and Culture Department in Sealaska Heritage Institute. I'm very pleased to welcome everybody here. I'd like to extend my thanks to Sealaska Corporation for the use of this boardroom, and also to Madonna Moss for offering to devote her time with us today. Many of you know Madonna. I don't think she needs a lot of introduction. We all know her from an earlier work she did here on subsistence lifeways with a lot of Tlingit elders, and also with her work on Tlingit forts and her early work for the Forest Service at Auk Nu and other places around Auk Bay. But she has been a professor of anthropology and archaeology at the University of Oregon since 1990. She works in a lot of areas, all the way from California and Oregon to the northern part of the Northwest Coast culture area, and published extensively. She's concentrates in the use of birds and shellfish and fish and marine mammals and land mammals, and also emphasizes the importance of those resources for cultural and identity in the area, in the culture area, and also has very important interest in also making the results of her work relevant for modern management issues relating to these resources. So she's very contemporary in her perspective on the importance of the information that she develops. So we're very pleased to have her share a portion of her work. She's worked on herring quite extensively. Recently worked with Tom Thornton's project on herring, and also on her own, and is connected with people in British Columbia and the Herring School, and she'll go into that. But she's speaking today on the Archaeology of Herring. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Madonna Moss.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for being here. I'm very happy to be here, and it's a privilege to talk to Sealaska. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the archaeology of herring. And I'd like to start by acknowledging the Sitka tribe, who I've spent the last week with, and all my colleagues and friends in Sitka. I'd particularly like to thank Tom Thornton for involving me in the herring synthesis project. Tom is now at the University of Oxford. Sealaska Heritage. Oh, but you are here. That's right, you are here. And you have been at the University of Alaska Southeast, and you've been all around the country. And when Tom and I worked on the herring synthesis project, it was when he was at Portland State University. And we were proud to have you in the state of Oregon, Tom. And now you're here, but you're also there. So, and also like to thank Sealaska Heritage Institute, Dr. Rosita Worrell, Dr. Chuck Smythe, and Zachary Jones, who's helped set up again. And special thanks to my colleagues and friend in Juneau, some of whom are here, including Joanne George, who is a long-term friend and has taught me a lot over the years. Thank you to the local people, Tlingit and non-Tlingit, who've helped me learn about what's going on in Southeast Alaska. I'd also like to acknowledge new colleagues, Sharon Wilds and Ginny Eckert, who I'm very excited to meet and hopefully work with in the future. So we know that herring is important in the ecosystem. Herring have been called a cultural keystone species, and we know that they're an important foundation of the system. They feed not just people, but all sorts of fish, birds, marine mammals, etc. And the people in this room know this more than anybody. This is this $1 million set, a record-breaking set in 2008, in which 1,500 tons of herring was taken out of Sitka Sound in a single net load. And this was worth over $1 million. So this kind of fishery that we have going on in Sitka Sound is very lucrative, or can be very lucrative. And this is a fairly recent phenomena. But this fishery is having a dramatic impact. And the reason that is, and most of you know this, is that when these fish are taken out of the system, it's their ovaries, the roe that is prized. And those eggs aren't even fully mature. But that is what is the delicacy that's prized in Japan right now. And those are shipped, they're processed, taken out of Alaska, processed in China, sold in Japan for fairly high prices. But what that means is that the herring don't get to lay their eggs in the intertidal and subtidal regions. They don't get to reproduce if they're taken out of the system in the order of 20,000 tons. So the Tlingit and hideaways of collecting herring eggs makes much more sense from an ecological standpoint in that, yes, some of the eggs are collected, but most of the eggs are left behind so the fish can reproduce. So the traditional means of taking herring was something that was sustainable. So today I'm going to talk about my history of interest in this research topic. Talk briefly about how herring are studied archaeologically. Then I want to try to encapsulate some of the results of the herring synthesis project, in particular the archaeological component of that project. But of course, when we worked on that, Tom Thornton and others, the idea was to put together the information from the oral history, from the history of catch statistics, from the biological data that was available, from the cultural data that was available, and try to make sense of it in a holistic way. So I will place the archaeological component in the larger cultural context, which of course is the result of Dr. Thornton's work. I will present a synopsis of this zooarchaeological analysis that we did. Colleagues in British Columbia and I put together the same kind of data that Virginia Butler and I put together for the herring synthesis project. We broadened that project. We looked at Alaska, British Columbia, and Washington, and this is the paper that was published just last month. Then I'll talk about our current study of ancient DNA, actually taking DNA out of the herring bones that are found in archaeological sites, and then point to the future. I got interested in herring because they showed up in archaeological sites when I was working on my dissertation. And my dissertation research essentially started when I came to Alaska in 1978 and started to work for the Forest Service. And I have many Forest Service colleagues that I'm indebted to, and including Forest Service fellow employees Matthew Fred, who was a Forest Service employee at that time, and Gabriel George. I studied a set of sites near Angoon, Alaska on Admiralty Island, and herring bones were found in most of the sites. 7 of 8 of the sites had herring bones. But one in particular, this site at Garns Point, which is on the inside of Favorite Bay, this was very rich in herring bones, and I was very interested in what was found. And what you see here is a microphotograph showing the herring vertebra. A close-up of those vertebrae that show up in archaeological sites. The other thing to remember is that herring are associated with what was an incredibly traumatic event in the history of Angoon. When I first went to Angoon, all the elders told me about this event before they would talk to me about anything else. And all of you in this room probably know the story of the U.S. Navy bombing the city of Angoon in 1882. And I won't recount the whole story, but it happened in October. It happened at a time of year when people were processing herring for oil. And so I think the processing of herring for oil is also something that's embedded in the memory of this event in Angoon. It also reminds us that even though today we think about herring being fished commercially in the spring when they first appear, they aggregate in large numbers, it's the roe that the fishery is after, we think of them as a spring resource because in the spring they attract all these other animals, fish and birds, etc., which were also the object of human hunting. But herring were important in different regions during different seasons. So in this area of Admiralty Island, it was in the summer into the fall that the herring were more numerous and people knew how to take advantage of them. And in the life cycle of herring, it's the summer and into the fall in which they get really oil rich. Their highest oil content is in October and November. So this would be a great time to process them for oil. The Killisnoo plant near Angoon, which was in operation from 1878. These pictures are a little bit later, but it started in 1878. It was in operation until it burned down in 1928. The Killisnoo plant initially was for the industrial production of oil from whales, but in 1882 they switched to herring. And what you see here is a 100-foot long box that's filled with herring. So there were massive quantities of herring that were taken out of Chatham Straits and processed into hundreds of barrels of oil. And this was an oil that had a variety of industrial functions, but also, believe it or not, was sent to Britain, and the fishy scent odor was removed and it was remarketed as salad oil, which is kind of interesting. Anyhow, the herring oil was a popular product for that time, and lots of herring were taken out of this region. Herring, of course, is just one of the many foods that's important to Tlingit people, and thank you, Chuck, for mentioning this book that we first did in 1984. This was Richard Newton and I put together information from 23 Tlingit elders, 2 of whom were still with us when the book came out for the 3rd time in 2005. And this is Lydia George here on the right with 2 of her granddaughters, and Matilda Gamble here. They were able to be there when we reissued the book, and with the assistance, under the direction of Lillian Petershaw, Joanne Witta, and Don Bremer, who had worked with people here in Juneau. They had worked with a variety of people who decided that it was time to change the title of the book. Because subsistence had taken on a variety of meanings, some of them pejorative, over the years, the Tlingit people who consulted with Lillian wanted to change the book to Ha Atayi Ha Kusti Yixati, which means our food is our Tlingit way of life. And that was a way to reclaim, I think, the importance of food, the centrality of food, the importance of getting food from the land, from special resource places during the specific seasons when it's available, and all of the activities around the obtaining the food, the processing the food, the sharing the food, the distributing the food, all of that is central to Tlingit identity. And I think that's nicely encapsulated in the revised title. And we know food is generously served at all Tlingit events that I've been to. And when I look at this setup of food that I had in 2005, I ate everything on that picture in one sitting. I don't know how I did it. I mean, it was seal meat, deer meat, 2 types of salmon, coho and king salmon, I believe, herring eggs. I'm not sure. Well, the event went on for a long time. I guess that's why I was able to eat it. Okay. And some of the issues related to subsistence, if you're interested, are discussed in more depth in this article. In particular, what I do in this article is it is a critique of anthropologists' role in the management and regulation of subsistence by Alaska Natives. Okay, but we're focusing more on the herring today, so we'll move ahead to that. And the Herring Synthesis Project, initiated by Tom Thornton, who is the principal investigator, pulled together incredible information on the use of herring. Tom interviewed over 80 people and pulled together data from interviews of over 100 people. And so I think it was over 200 interviews were pulled together. And it was put in a massive compilation. The report is 750 pages long, and the testimony is there in the words of the people who know about herring. It's really an impressive document, and it is available on the web through the North Pacific Research Board. So Tom Thornton and his student Jamie Hebert put together the LTK, or the local traditional knowledge. Virginia Butler and I from Portland State University and her student, Tate Elder, put together the zooarchaeological data. And what we did was compile what evidence there was in the archaeological literature that could inform us about herring abundance and the geographic distribution of sites with herring. And then Fritz Funk, who is a retired Alaska Department of Fish and Game biologist, put together the history of the fishery. And that was very informative as well and provided a really important context for this work. But it was interesting in putting together the zooarchaeological information because there wasn't much information about Sitka, Sitka being the center of the commercial fishing industry. And there also is very little information about Juneau, which I want to talk about a little bit later. But it was the lack of information about Sitka that drew me to Sitka in 2011, and with the help of the Sitka tribe, I did this survey. And my intent was to try to do a more rigorous survey of sites in Sitka Sound. And of course, it's a huge geographic area. The Forest Service has done quite a bit of work on Forest Service land. But in terms of sites on the road system, there really hadn't been that many additional sites recorded since I had lived in Sitka in the early 1980s. And so I revisited some of those sites, and then we went out and found some more sites, including a clam garden. We documented these new sites, and people were interested in this survey work, but everybody was talking about herring all the time. And everybody that I talked to was very concerned about the urgent situation related to herring in Sitka Sound. And so the question became, well, what can we learn about herring from archaeological data? And it occurred to me that we don't have time to go out and excavate a lot more sites. Why don't we take advantage of sites that have already been excavated that have samples of herring bones and try to learn from them? So archaeological sites are sampled through excavation. And but to find herring bones, you have to use screens. You have to use fine mesh screens to recover these bones because they're very small. Another way to do it is to just take bulk samples, or that is just take all the soil and matrix from a particular level in a particular site, and to pack the whole thing home and to sort it in the lab, which is what's happening here. And of course, in these samples, there's lots of different things. It takes quite a bit of effort to process these kinds of samples and to sort them into different types of shellfish, for example, and identify the fish bones, pull out the rock, pull out the charcoal, the vegetal material, etc. So just to illustrate some of the strange things that archaeologists do, I will sort these broken up shells into taxon, and then I not just sort them, I count them. So for example, these are mussels. This is all mussels, and I'm counting mussel hinges to come up with the 643 hinges from this particular level in this particular site. And in this particular site, we had a lot of barnacles, which is kind of unusual to have as many of this particular barnacle as possible. In general, archaeologists tend to just say we have barnacles. They don't even try to identify them to species. But because we had so many here, I did learn about barnacles, and I did count these little plates, and we did have a lot of barnacles in this particular site. So these are the kinds of things we do. And we look at the animal bones. Lots of deer bones, marine mammal bones. This is a big albatross bone. But some of the bones are in pretty poor condition. You know, they've been calcined and burned and processed for different things. So we can't always identify them to species, but these are the kinds of materials that zooarchaeologists work with. And at the University of Oregon, I have a collection of marine mammals, birds, fish, invertebrate shellfish that I've been building over the years. And some of the materials are organized by individual, and some of them are organized synoptically. So for example, this is what a coho salmon looks like in my lab. And these are just a single element, the ulna of birds. And so they've been sorted by size here. And I have maybe 3 drawers of bird ulnae. So it's nice to have collections that are both synoptically organized, and individuals in a tray, and I'm working on that, but there's a long ways to go. So in terms of how we get this specimen, this is a harbor seal, for example, that was stranded on the Oregon coast, and a couple students and I butchered it, and this is what it looks like today in the lab. Now again, herring bones are so small that a lot of them do fall through 2mm mesh. And so when we recover them archaeologically, we know we're only getting a small proportion of the number that were there. But you need at least 1/8" screens or 2mm mesh to be able to recover any of these herring bones. Most of what we get are vertebra. We get some prootics and pterotics, and sometimes we get other elements, but the bones of herring are pretty fragile, so they don't often preserve very well archaeologically. But these are all archaeological specimens of herring. So summarizing some of the results from Tom Thornton's herring synthesis project. With regard to the zooarchaeology, we did have some good information from the area around Angoon, because I had sampled with 2mm mesh in my dissertation. We had some information from Tebenkoff Bay on Kuyu Island, and then we had information from from the Prince of Wales archipelago, but remarkably there was hardly anything from Sitka or Juneau. In North America, herring have a variety of different kinds of uses. People have traditionally used them for food, favoring their meat, their flesh. Sometimes they're smoked. They can be processed for oil. We know they're used as bait. And of course, herring eggs, the food that everyone loves to eat, in March and April especially. Another way to study the use of herring and other fish is to document fishing weirs and traps. And in Southeast Alaska, we have, I believe, over 1,000 wood stake weirs and stone traps that have been identified. Most of these are associated with salmon streams, and they're used to catch salmon. But some have been identified as potentially having been used to trap herring, including these near Petersburg at Sandy Beach fish trap, which were documented by Mark McCallum and Chuck Mobley. And this is one of the heart-shaped features made of stone that is at the vortex of these V-shaped traps that work with the tides. And so when the tides come in, the herring come in with them, and when the water goes out, the herring are caught within these stone walls. And of course, people were after the herring, but they were also after all our herring predators, which include the various birds that go after herring, the fish, and the sea mammals. And there are some archaeological sites where there have been investigations done on a shore site that's adjacent to one of these trap sites, and you just don't find herring bones in these sites. You find herring bones and the bones of all the animals that are predators of herring. What we found in the zooarchaeological component of the herring synthesis project is that there was a fairly small sample of sites where their data recovery methods were adequate to recover herring bones. It was something like 28 sites. So these are sites where there had been subsurface testing. So there had been quite a bit of subsurface testing done at these sites, but it was only a small proportion where they had used fine enough mesh screens to actually recover the herring bones. It was in the order of 28 sites. Of those 28 sites, though, 75% of them had herring. And so when you consider that if you use the right recovery techniques, you tend to find herring, what we found was the distribution of herring was fairly widespread geographically. One of the sites is located at Chuck Lake, which is lake here on Heceta Island in the outer Prince of Wales archipelago, and you can see it's a freshwater lake. But when it was occupied 8,000 years ago, this freshwater lake was connected to saltwater. So sea levels were such that this was a larger estuary. So in this saltwater environment 8,000 years ago were found Pacific cod, a variety of marine birds, and not very many, but some herring bones. And these were, at the time of the herring synthesis, the oldest herring bones in southeast Alaska, going back 8,200 years ago. So putting this together with information about the Angoon sites and elsewhere, Fritz Funk put together this data, which I think is really important, about how much herring has been taken out of the system over the years, starting in 1880 to the 2000s here. And what you see here in yellow, these bars here, this is when herring was commercially sold as salted fish. Fairly low use, but this was a pretty limited time period between maybe 1900 and 1915 when it was popular as food. You can see the amount of fish that's taken out of the system for bait is pretty low, but consistent through time. What you see in these clear bars here is this is the reduction fishery. So this is when the plant at Killisnoo was pulling lots and lots of herring, tons and tons of herring out of Chatham Straits and processing those fish for oil. And you can see how much was taken out. The peak was in 1929 when 80,000 tons was taken out of Chatham Straits, which is quite a lot of herring. What we see here is the beginning of the sacro fishery in Sitka Sound, which started in the 1970s. And people didn't start to commercially take sacro until the Japanese had already overexploited their local herring. So because of the fish being wiped out in Japan, that's when that industry shifted to southeast Alaska and to British Columbia. We'll come back to that again. But we know between, in the early part of the 20th century, that the industrial fishery was taking a lot out of Chatham Strait because boats had to go farther and farther south to get the herring to support the plant. And over time, the Killisnoo plant ended up competing with other herring reduction plants on both Baranof Island and Kuyu Island that were closer to where the herring were left. So it was clear that that industrial fishery was having an impact even in the early 20th century because of the economics had changed. In the 1880s, I believe it was Eliza Skidmore described miles and miles of herring being found in Chatham Straits. And by this time, let's say 1915, that had shifted. Here's some of the data that Tom Thornton put together based on the interviews that he did with, and the interviews that he consulted with over 200 people. And these are all the places where herring was noted. So you can see how widespread these localities are. Lots and lots of places, lots and lots of place names are indicated here, much more widespread geographically than is indicated by the commercial fishery today. This is labeled herring catch, Douglas 1895, but Tom, you were saying the other night that these might have been dead herring that that found their way onto this beach for some other purpose. So I don't know if you want to clarify that, but anyhow, we get a sense for the abundance of herring, the numbers of herring here in March in Douglas, Alaska, just across the channel. So we can look at the purse seine fishery numbers in recent years, and we see that 2012 and 2013, the numbers were down. Very high guideline harvest level promoted in 2012, and less than half of it was taken. Now, we don't know why those numbers went down. We don't really understand, and my understanding is that fishery scientists don't understand why we get such fluctuations in herring numbers. But last year, it was only 5,700 tons that were taken out of Sitka Sound. This year, it was 17,000 tons, more than the guideline harvest level was taken out of Sitka Sound just last week. So this is pretty significant. And these numbers look pretty healthy, but when you consider that in 1929 it was 80,000 tons, they don't look as good. So if you cut off this part of the chart and you see the herring numbers going up, you think, oh, we've got a healthy fishery. We're taking out a reasonable number of fish based on what we have. But if we look at a longer term perspective and see what was going on in the early part of the 20th century, we can see that the herring were much more abundant back in the 19th century than they have been recently. So that long-term perspective is something that historical data can tell us. Funks data, oral historical data can tell us the material that was collected by Tom Thornton, but also archaeological data can contribute to the story as well. So we know that we have herring use in Southeast Alaska. At this point, we knew that it went back over 8,000 years ago. From what we could tell, where sites had been sampled adequately, herring bones showed up. And we concluded that herring use was ubiquitous. We concluded that the reduction fisheries had overfished. That although the Sitka stocks were relatively stable, other valued stocks had declined. It was interesting how little archaeological information there was from Sitka and Juneau. Overall, again, Thornton et al. Concluded that herring stocks had become increasingly fragmented, and we inferred that herring were being managed in depleted status. The archaeological information on herring came out in a chapter that was published in this book, and also we synthesized information to the extent we could in a short version of the herring synthesis that came out in the Journal of Ecological Anthropology. When I presented this information to at conferences and whatnot, it really resonated with people in British Columbia, because Native people, First Nations people, had been talking to archaeologists and talking to them about the herring. The archaeologists were aware of the issue, and what we decided to do, Dana Lepofsky and Ian McKechnie and I, decided to expand what we did in herring synthesis to British Columbia. So the Thornton et al. Synthesis project inspired this additional research that we did, which was to compile zooarchaeological records for a much broader geographic region. And we made it into British Columbia, into the Washington coast. We didn't quite make it to Oregon, but I would like to do that in the future. You can see the herring milt here in British Columbia. And of course, the same situation is going on there with herring attracting all sorts of other animals. And so they're really important throughout the ecosystem. So Ian McKechnie was the lead author here. He just got his PhD from the University of British Columbia, and he's currently a postdoc at University of Oregon working with me. And then Dana Lepofsky is the head of the herring school, and she is at Simon Fraser University in Burnaby, British Columbia. And this just shows you some of the geographic distribution of sites that we have with a lot of herring. And basically, where we have sites, we have a lot of herring in those sites if they've been adequately studied. So it's a similar story to what we found in Southeast Alaska. Herring was the single most numerous fish in 95 of the 171 assemblages that we found had been sampled adequately for herring. And then herring is the second most numerous fish in 41 of the assemblages. So again, the message was pretty clear. If the sites have been sampled adequately, if their find screens had been used, people are turning up lots of herring bones. And this is Ian McKechnie here, who is the lead author. Now, the relative abundance of herring was different in different parts of the coast. So in Southeast Alaska, for example, it ranged between about 5 and 40%. And I don't know that we're not necessarily saying that herring is the most important fish to all of the Northwest coast. We cannot translate numbers of bones in an archaeological site to economic importance. So we're not saying that, but we're saying that they are abundant, they are ubiquitous, they are geographically widespread. This area here, the Salish Sea, which is down near Vancouver and Victoria in southern British Columbia, herring bones made up a tremendous percentage of those assemblage, ranging between about 40% to 90%. So this is an area where herring spawn herring used to spawn on both sides of the Gulf of Georgia, on the Olympic Peninsula, this whole region, and people were taking advantage of that abundance. They were super abundant in this part of the coast. Moving to our current study of ancient DNA. I am not a DNA specialist. This work is being done by my colleague Dongyu Yang in Simon Fraser University and his student Antonio Rodriguez, who is extracting ancient DNA here. And what happens is that the bones get ground up, they get purified, but in these old bones there's the target DNA, and then there's all this contamination that has to be sorted out. And then it's extracted, then it's amplified, and then it's sequenced. And there are all sorts of protocols about trying to control or to limit contamination and to remove contamination. And these are some of my colleagues. You can't tell who's who in these outfits, but and this article appeared in 2012, and the lead author is Camilla Speller, who's at the University of York and who is a former student of Dongyu Yang. And what we did in this study is we had 85 ancient samples. These were mostly from British Columbia, but 10 of them are from 3 archaeological sites in southeast Alaska that I contributed to the study. And Dongyu and his students had an incredibly high success rate of extractions. They were able to get ancient DNA from these tiny little fish bones. We looked at 3 different markers: mitochondrial DNA, and then microsatellites and single nucleotide polymorphisms that come from nuclear DNA. And what we found was high haplotype diversity, but that the mitochondrial DNA and the microsatellites weren't able to discriminate the different populations of herring that we think may be there. And our colleague, who's the geneticist here and the modeler, Lorenz Hauser, his assessment was that single nucleotide polymorphisms would be the best way to survey the genetic population structure. Some SNPs show high differentiation because they're located to genes under selection, and they are optimal for this population genetic analysis. Now, what I'm going to do in a slide or two is compare the ancient results to the modern results. But this article is an analysis of modern herring. So they're working with DNA that's much better preserved than what we can do with the ancient DNA. But in studying the genetics of modern herring, there are basically 2 lineages, or there are 3 lineages, but they kind of break out into 2 parts, with Northwest Pacific and Asia being lineage A, and then on the northwest coast of North America, from Alaska, southeast Alaska into British Columbia, etc., we've got 2 lineages here, B and C, that have been identified. Now we're going to look at the archaeological sites that have been sampled in southeast Alaska. These are sites with herring. You can see we have some near Sitka, we have some near Rangoon, we have some in the Prince of Wales archipelago region. We have a site here, but we don't have samples from that. Those have not been, I can't find where those are curated. This is Kaufman Cove, this is North Point, but we don't have any from Juneau. We don't have any from the mainland other than that at North Point, which is highly unfortunate. This red spot here is Yaddock Creek, and these are the oldest herring bones from the northwest coast in general. They go back over 10,000 calendar years ago. They were just identified recently by Jim Bechtel and Risa Carlson. Okay, so 17 sites in southeast Alaska have yielded herring ancient DNA. And these are the sites that I just showed you on the map. The oldest, again, is Upper Yaddock Creek on Prince of Wales, and those are the dates, over 10,000 calendar BP, which is incredible that we got anything out of those little herring bones. Of the 17, 4 sites are around Sitka, And these were all ones that I got samples for in 2011. Jamestown Bay, which we think was a fort, Stargavin, White Rock shell midden, and Krestoff shell midden. Stargavin is in pretty good shape. Those of you familiar with the Sitka road system, it was excavated by the Forest Service, and although they didn't use adequate screens at the time, they did curate bulk samples, and I was able to go back to those and recover herring bones. This is a site at Jamestown Bay that's on this little headland on the shoreward side of Sawmill Creek Road. And when I first recorded it in 1983, there was a single house there, and now there's a whole complex of houses that have been built there. It's practically covered in house and concrete. And along the parking lot, there's archaeological material eroding out, and there's little salmon jaws here. So this is a site that is we're currently losing data onto the pavement in this site. Here's another site where we're losing material into the intertidal zone in this case. This is a site on a rocky headland that I identified in 1983, and when I went back in 2011, there were trees that had collapsed into the intertidal zone, probably with a little bit of sea level change. And I took a sample then, and then this is what is left now with most of the archaeological material having been lost, rained on and then washed away into the water. Here's a site Jonathan Feldposh and I documented in 2011, and again it's found in a root wad. We were able to get a sample of herring bones from this site. So of the 17 sites, as I mentioned, no sites are around Juneau, and only one from the mainland, the North Point site. New is a fort site that's out the road that's located around Auk Bay. This site I had visited back in the 1970s at a time when there was no archaeological material. So we don't, even though there had been one investigation done at this site, there were no herring bones preserved or recovered. There were no bones at all recovered, as I recall. But when I walked at this site yesterday, the site has changed quite a bit. There's quite a bit of construction that's gone on, houses on either side, and this huge, I don't even know what this is. They've built this huge ramp that parallels the shore. I don't know if it's a retaining wall or whatever. But alongside this side of the headland, there's archaeological material slipping out of the site. So, I mean, I know these pictures don't show you everything, but this is an area about 4 meters by 4 meters in which there's shell midden literally falling into the intertidal zone. In this area, I did not observe any herring bones yesterday, but I did see fish bone. There is some decent bone preservation there. I'd love to take a sample from there. This is part of a seal pelvis that I found, and around this entire site, there were 4 exposures. There are 4 places around this site that are now falling into the intertidal zone. So I'll just say that, you know, as an archaeologist, this is one of my urgent concerns, is that we are losing material every day because with climate change and tiny little increase in sea level, if you have high tides and storms, you can get material that gets washed out in a tide or two. And you can have the collapse of archaeological material and the eventual complete loss of archaeological material. Okay, so back to the ancient DNA analysis. We have 91 bones from 18 sites. One of the sites is in Washington. The success rate of Danya and his students is 81%, which is remarkable. If you look at the older samples, they are definitely the ones that are more degraded. But if you look at those samples that are less than 2,000 years ago, the success rate is 100%, which is incredible. So the older sites with samples that failed to amplify or were not extracted were this Upper Yadok site. These were the 10,000-year-old samples. We only had one that was successful, but I do have more that can be tested. Chuck Lake Locality 2, we had 2 fail, but 1 was successful for this 8,000-year-old site. We also had failures at some of these other older sites. So at Kaufman Cove and North Point, there were single failures, and at Hidden Falls, we had some failures. So yes, the material does degrade. It can't be recovered from every bone, but it is remarkable that some is recovered. What this network diagram shows is that is a comparison between modern and ancient, going back to those lineages A, B, and C that I showed in an earlier slide. So A is actually the Northwest Pacific. I'm going to get Camilla to redo these, so this one's over here, because it is a little confusing. But this is the Northwest Pacific. This is Asia. And B and C are our Northeast Pacific, our Northwest Coast samples. The BC ones are in green, and the Alaska ones are in yellow. And you can see they're mostly in B and C. And in this way, the ancient data do support and are consistent with the modern genetic data. I'm very excited about Sharon Wilds' work, especially this particular study that she did, because this is a study of the modern genetics of herring, and it indicates that in her study of, I think it was 15 microsatellites, she was able to find, she and her colleagues were able to find some discrimination between the different populations of herring. And what they found were that the Berners Bay and Lynn Canal herring looked different then and could be distinguished from the outer coast herring at Sitka and maybe Craig, the outer coast herring from this area, which is pretty exciting. The Hobart Bay fell within this group, but Hoona Sound also looked like it could be distinguished. It was different in some ways. And Sharon is here and she can explain this more than I can. So if you have questions about this, we have the expert in the room. But this is very hopeful to me because perhaps we can also find this archaeologically as well. But getting there will take some work. We do hope that the ancient DNA analysis of herring can help us assess the former genetic diversity and abundance of herring in the distant past. And we hope that this can then be compared more adequately to the modern to understand the effects of industrial fishing. And we know that herring is a pelagic species, and as Sharon and her co-authors has written, there's a tremendous amount of connectivity between the different groups of herring. And we know that they are resilient, but we don't really know the effects of the past couple hundred years on herring, and we don't know what the situation was like in the truly distant past, 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 years ago. I do hope eventually that the results from our study can be used by local communities to help inform fishing policy. And ideally, this could be combined with strategies for restoration, like some of the strategies that Tom Thornton has proposed. There is a demand for herring in Japan. We know that, but it's not something that may be there forever. So maybe if the demand in Japan stops, then the herring will recover without much conflict. But currently, these are Canadian herring that are prized in the Japanese market. And this is a slide shared by Shingo Hamada, who has been studying herring in Japan. Shingo explains that these are actually Russian herring bodies that have been stuffed with second-grade Kazunoko from Alaska. So, I mean, people are going to all sorts of lengths to market herring and herring eggs. So it's quite interesting, really. But there are human physiologists, paleontologists, evolutionary biologists, and anthropologists who are suggesting that things that we get from herring, certain nutrients that we get from herring, may have been critically important in the development of our species going back 100, 200,000 years ago. So we're familiar with how we're all supposed to be eating omega-3 fatty acids like DHA and EPA, and that these are critical to human health. There are some anthropologists who believe that these actually stimulated the growth of the larger brain 200,000 years ago. We know that these are important in fetal development, maintenance of the brain, the eye, the heart, our immune systems. They are available in marine foods, we know that. Herring are particularly rich in them, and other small forage fish that are oily fish. Bird's egg yolks are also rich in these nutrients. So we know that these marine foods are critically important, and we think that they were critically important in human evolution. Herring is just one of these oily fish that's found around the world. Anchovies and sardines are some of the others that are important. They're low in the food web, they reproduce fast, they feed big fish, birds, mammals, marine mammals. But 1/3 of all the wild fish caught on the earth end up as fish meal or fish oil. And 80% of the world's fish meal and fish oil is used in aquaculture. And of course, one of the most popular in the world is carp in China. And in fact, some of our herring from southeast Alaska may end up in the bodies of those carp in China because of this, how the industry has evolved over time. So it seems kind of crazy in a way for us to be processing all these fish into fish oil that's used to feed domestic animals like carp and pigs and chickens when we could go more directly to eat those small fish. So these small fish are rich in omega-3s. They're less likely to have toxins than longer-lived fish. They are healthy proteins. We as North Americans are not in the habit of eating small fish, small bony fish. And we import over 90% of our seafood, which is incredible. I was in Sitka on Thursday night and went out to eat as a guest of colleagues over there. We went to the Fly Fish Inn, which is this lovely little place right on the waterfront. And I thought it would be nice to have steamer clams. And so I ordered steamer clams. And then I decided, well, maybe I should ask where they're from. And they were from Thailand. And, you know, the beaches over there have lots and lots of steamer clams, but they're not being marketed. We've come to Alaska and we're eating steamer clams and they're from Thailand. It seems kind of crazy. Forage fish are leaving the developing world and they end up in the bellies of livestock and farm salmon, etc. If we consider all of the world's fish meal bound fish, it would be equivalent to 400 million healthy fish dinners that could be eaten directly by people. So we could choose to eat more small fish, and we could choose to eat more local shellfish. Fish worship, is it wrong? I don't know. I don't think it is. Okay, so the archaeology of herring, ideally reconstructing the past to redeem the future. I do think that herring are resilient. I do think that some reductions in fishing, commercial fishing, will be necessary. But I think we need these reductions before more genetic diversity is lost. So I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you. Yes, Rosita.
So, according to your data, the herring stock now are in a depleted state in comparison to early historical periods, but we are, I guess it's I don't know if it's a policy question, but we are regulating it as if it were a healthy stock. That's what it looks like to me.
Yeah. So I think when we were back in Sitka, and I think it was in response to Tom's lecture last week. Let's see if I can find this. Find that graph, Fritz's graph. Tom, you know where I'm going. If we look at it, there it is. If we look at it, if we don't pay attention to this and we look at this and we see the numbers, they do seem to be going up and it does look local if we just look to the 1970s. But if we look a little bit further in the past, it looks pretty pathetic, I think. Maybe that was a poor choice of words. But, and it's true that with archaeological data, we are not going to be able to give numbers. We cannot give you we cannot translate archaeological data into numbers of fish. But we know that people talk about superabundant herring throughout this region. And we know that the herring used to spawn in Auk Bay. and they don't, and they haven't for a while. So I think, and if you look at where they show up archaeologically, they just seem to have been very common and very widespread. And I think what we've got now is a very fragmentary, piecemeal kind of patchwork, whereas before I don't want to say they were everywhere, but they were in different places at different times of the year, but the numbers were far more than what they are today. So, yeah. Did I answer your question?
An EPA report that came out that said they're not endangered at all.
Right, right. And it's partly because people are looking at the numbers, and the numbers are still large, although the numbers are hypothetical. But they also think that there's limited genetic diversity. And so, I'm sorry, that there's quite a lot of genetic diversity, but I think that archaeologically we might be able to get information that may confirm that they were as diverse in the past as they are now, so maybe there's not a problem, or we could get archaeological information that says they were way more diverse than we ever thought, and maybe it's time to stop harvesting so many. So, I mean, at this point, the archaeological data are consistent with what Sharon Wilds and others are indicating in terms of there being a metapopulation. On the other hand, she has also documented some differentiation, and I think that there's the possibility that we'll be able to document that archaeologically as well. So we've got a ways to go. Sharon has generously agreed to make some samples available to Lorenz Hauser at University of Washington. He's got a lot of work to do to try to survey, to try to find where the SNPs might be under selection that could help us with these comparisons. And then we have the technical challenge of finding those SNPs archaeologically, which is another expensive task. I'm hoping that we can proceed with that work, though, before more diversity is lost. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, can I ask another question?
Yeah.
And, I was real surprised at that development at Ocnu myself. I hadn't seen that, I guess, or I must have missed it. And what can we do to help you so that you could do that archaeological work there?
Well, I'm willing to go take a sample there tomorrow morning. I need to find out if that's legal. I mean, it's on state tidelands, and I know I could get permission from the state, but and I don't think I actually have to cross private land. But I would prefer not to get arrested, you know, for poking around an archaeological site. So if I can get your permission to make some phone calls, I'd love to take a sample. And I can't guarantee that there will be herringbones in there, but I suspect that there will be. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's sad to see that kind of thing happening. Yeah, and it's happening all over our coastlines. Yeah, yeah.
So for sockeye, I know that there's for like estimating historical sockeye spawning abundance. I know that people use like stable isotope technology in lake cores, and I'm wondering if that's something that's been talked about for reconstructing herring abundance historically, and if you can even distinguish herring from salmon using stable isotopes.
Well, we can distinguish herring bones from salmon bones. Well, isotope signatures, yeah, I haven't explored that. We can identify salmon bones. We cannot identify salmon vertebrate to species without ancient DNA. So I do have a study that's been published just last fall, in which we did an ancient DNA study of salmon from Kaufman Cove to look at what species were represented there. But to get at ecological questions related to salmon with archaeological data would be a very interesting and worthwhile thing to do. But I don't know of anybody who's trying to tackle that yet. But you know, one of the things that I'm concerned about is that we've got all these hatchery fish, and we've got farm salmon from British Columbia and everything. I think that the salmon of today are already changing in ways that are going to be different from our archaeological examples. So, for example, there were some morphologists that put together this method that was supposed to be useful in identifying archaeological salmon bones to species using their size and shape. And some of us tried this morphometric method, and it didn't seem to be producing consistent results. And I think the reason why it wasn't is that they're using, to develop the method, they were using modern salmon that are already hatchery fish and cannot be directly compared to the ancient fish. So we have already fooled around a lot with the genetics of salmon, and they're going to look different than the archaeological examples. But there could be questions that could be addressed archaeologically. I don't know of anybody who's done isotopic studies of salmon bones to address any questions. For herring. Isotopic studies of herring. I don't know of anybody who's tried to do that. Yeah. I think you'd actually need more herring, you'd need more bone from a herring to do an isotopic study than you would to do the ancient DNA, which is kind of interesting. You know, to do a radiocarbon date on herring, I needed like 50 herring bones, even an accelerator date, an AMS date. To do an isotopic study, you would need to have a sample of many bones as well. The ancient DNA, because it's amplified from there, is more doable.
For sockeye, I apologize. For sockeye, they were using soil cores and looking at marine-derived components of stable isotopes in lake cores, out of soil cores,
Okay.
basically. So they weren't actually looking at.
Oh, they weren't looking at the bones.
Yeah, they were looking at soils.
Oh, okay.
Anyway,
And I don't think that would work for marine
wouldn't.
species
It
because
wouldn't.
you don't see the marine versus fresh difference. You could do it
Okay.
because they're bringing marine signal into a freshwater ecosystem.
Okay. Well, I'm glad we have expertise to answer that question. Yes.
I had a question about the herring that I believe we've lost as a result of the Exxon Valdez. Has there been a study on that? I've always been curious when these herring regions collapse, I think in California or maybe further south,
Right.
and how and if they relate to our herring population.
Right, right. I mean, the Prince William Sound situation is really still dire for the herring, as I understand it. And we don't have any archaeological sites from Prince William Sound specifically that have produced herring bones that we could test. But we do have some from Kodiak. And I have procured some samples from a couple of sites on Kodiak and one between Kodiak and the Alaska Peninsula. And I'm trying to pursue more samples from that region so that we can expand this study into South Central and Southwest Alaska and understand the ancient genetics more broadly. Yeah. But that is obviously a very critical issue, and the herring have not come back. Yeah, it's very sad. Well, thanks. Yeah.
What is the lack of data in Juneau and Sitka? Is that just less sampling in those areas, or is it because there's less use of herring, or what do you think?
Well, it's less archaeological investigation. There are plenty of sites in these areas, but there hasn't been the archaeological investigation using the techniques that would be adequate to recover the herring bones. So, yeah, it's unfortunate. Yes.
I have a worry about the data up here on the screen, and that is the fishery exploitation rate. So today it's maybe 20% or somewhat less than that.
That's the estimate.
Multiplier for the red bars might be on the order of 5, whereas a multiplier in the white bars, I'm guessing, might be a multiplier of 1, that they just went out and took fish. And so the relative heights of those curves could be adjusted in some way. What do you think about that?
I'm not sure I understand your question. I do know that the Alaska Department of Fish and Game does use the 20% figure for coming up with the guideline harvest level today. Certainly fisheries people they didn't have any quotas back there. You know, they didn't bring in quotas until after there had been a decline. But my understanding is that we don't really know how many fish are out there. It is an estimate. It's not as if every herring has been counted and that those are real numbers. But there are a bunch of fishery scientists here who could better answer that question besides me. So there might even be people from Alaska Department of Fish and Game here who would like to say something, who understand those harvest models. This must be a fisheries group over here. You're smiling over here.
I think what the point that he's trying to make is that when you're using catch data, you have just as much information about how hard they're fishing as you have about how many fish are out there to catch. And so it's tricky to use that to make inferences about what the actual abundance was over this time.
Right, right. So these are just catch statistics. Yeah, yeah. So we don't really know what the abundance was. Yeah. And archaeological data are not going to tell us in absolute numbers what the abundance is either. They're just not, because those are catch statistics of a different type. They're not directly comparable, but they're not sampling the universe of fish in a way that perhaps a fishery scientist would do that today. They're taking those species that are more accessible, that are critical for people's livelihoods. Yeah. So would you like to restate or respond? No? Okay. All right. Would you? Okay. There was a question over here. Yes?
I just have a question about the archaeological data. I know most of the data is just showing presence of herring, but
right.
Can you say anything about the abundance in these different areas, relative abundance, and relating to the populations of herring that might have been in localities, smaller localities, or is it just?
Well, I mean, I do think that certainly in Favored Bay near Rangoon, there were a lot of herring in those sites, and that's historically a place where there were a lot of herring, but there was a lot of herring in that Garns Point site, which seems to reflect the historical abundance. In the one site from Craig that I was able to include in this study, there were a lot of herring bones there, which again mirrors the abundance of herring in Fish Egg Island and Craig, at least historically. Sitka, we would expect a lot of herring, but I don't know that I'm willing to say that if they don't show up archaeologically, they weren't there yet, because we don't have enough sites that have been adequately sampled. But I do think they were more widespread, just because they show up. I mean, if you screen for them, they show up in most cases. So they are an indication of a healthy ecosystem in which there were plenty of other resources, and so that's where people were. Did you want to follow up with that? I'm not sure I answered where you wanted to go with that.
Yeah, I mean, it's the limitation of the archaeological record mainly, but
Right.
I was just hoping that there could be more information, coming out.
Yeah.
Maybe with more analysis, with more investigation
Yeah.
of different sites.
Yeah, we do need more investigation. I just hope that we can proceed in a way that's going to be rapid enough to conserve the herring. Yeah. Yes.
Do you notice any difference in the marine predator assemblages in the sites with and without herring?
That is a question that we have not addressed. We potentially can address that in the database that Ian McKechnie and Dana and I have put together. Our next step with that database is to look more holistically at all the fish in those assemblages and to try to understand the geographic or cultural distributions of the fish in different areas. So we're going to move to talk about the other fish, and then moving on to talk about all the animals that feed on herring would be a later step. In archaeological sites, and I failed to mention this, but of all the bones that are found in archaeological sites, of all the animal bones, 85% of them in Alaska, Southeast Alaska, and British Columbia, 85% of them are fish bones. People were fishermen. And so the fish are reasonably well sampled in archaeological analyses. Now, in terms of marine mammals, land mammals, and birds, their distribution in archaeological sites tends to be somewhat spottier. So whether or not we could get at that question, whether or not our samples are adequate to really reflect the complete group of animals that would be predators of herring, I don't know yet. But our next step in the analysis of that database is to look at the other fish. To look at the salmon, to look at the Pacific cod, the rockfish, the spiny dogfish, the sculpins. In some cases we have ooligan. Ooligan are fish that are even smaller than the herring, and so our recovery of them is even more spotty. But smelt, ooligan sometimes show up archaeologically. So we're gonna expand and look at the other fish first. That's the first step. Yeah, thanks. Yes.
In the sacro fishery now, once the ovaries are removed and sold to Japan, is there a use for the remainder of the body of the herring?
Well, my understanding from several years ago, and I think it was maybe Shingo was telling us about this, Tom, a couple years ago, was that those carcasses, the bones and the flesh, were being used to fertilize agricultural fields in Japan. Now, I could be wrong, but when we were in Sitka last week quizzing people about this, and there are different stories about this, but my understanding, and Tom, please correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that some proportion of them now, because they're being processed in China, the fish, and the fish meal prices are pretty high. It's the fish meal that is kind of the fish meal that the Chinese processors are getting out of the system is good for them economically, and then they are able to ship the Kozunoko to Japan, and that also is a marketable product. So my understanding is that those fish remains are being ground into fish meal and used to feed carp, to feed livestock. Tom, correct me if I'm wrong.
I don't know the figures, but I think more of it is recovered than used to be. I think a lot of it used to be actually ground up in the processing, but now they recover more of the body of the herring and use it for fish meal, and that's partly because fish farming has grown a lot in the past 2-3 decades. So there's a market and for fertilizer and other animal feed.
Yeah. So I hope you all enjoy herring for lunch. Yes, yes. The fish itself. Oh, but there may be one more question here.
Okay, thank you so much. Hello. Hi, good afternoon. My name is Paulette Marino, and I have the privilege of living in Sitka. And I also had the privilege of hearing your presentation last week. This is also Andrew Roberts from Sitka. He's Yanni AD, and I'm Clean AD from Akwan. So I'm really glad that you're here sharing this information. And living in Sitka, we've also had the privilege to listen to many of our elders. Much of the traditional knowledge that's not only presented here in the presentation, that was just spoken very powerfully this last month. For example, Kiksadi Point House leader Fred Hope, he spoke. He was looking out over the Pioneer home and he said, "I have something to say." And with that, we contacted Raven Radio and the Sitka Sentinel, and there was an article, I believe it was March 26th, and he spoke about the herring. He spoke about seeing millions of herring along the beach, as have many other elders. And there's a huge concern with the Sitka people. There's a very huge concern, and I'm hoping that this presentation, and there was a presentation given after it by the gentleman over here in the corner, which was wonderful because it referred to traditional knowledge. And it also referred to, there comes a time that you've got to stand. There comes a time when enough is enough. And I think that that's what many of the people are saying. With the sacro fishery, as you see, taking place in Sitka, they had the first, second, third, and then the fourth opening. And on the third opening, they were very close to their quota. We actually called, or I called Fish and Game, and went by the office and said, "Would you close down now when you're so close?" And on the fourth one, they opened it, and they went over 1,000 pounds, as you know.
1,000 tons, yeah.
If I went out fishing with my fishing partner, and we caught one salmon over the limit of one salmon, we had fishing limit forward. You know, if I was fishing game, I would have 9,999 tickets. but it should be forwarded to me. But the point is that there is traditional knowledge, that we do have these things for time immemorial, that this is an extremely powerful resource. I really liked some of the presentations and the ideas that were given about traditional territory, continuing on with traditional territory. I know that just a few weeks ago during one of the sacro fisheries, Sitka Tribe of Alaska had worked very hard, as they do with Harvey Kitka and many of the other elders, L. Williams, and they worked very hard for years to set aside traditional territory, which is just a small area compared to what was traditional territory. And several of the seine boats actually came in, spooked the herring away from the spawning area towards their nets. And it really is a David and Goliath story, because can you imagine, several of the small boats were trying to stand up to 6 huge seine boats. And you think about, what is this really all about? There's 49 permit holders that have permits for the sacro fishery. And even many of them have reached out towards this movement and said, we also want to conserve this resource. So I would say I would just really encourage those that are present in this room, to work. And I hope that your work will continue to advocate. Our presenter has asked the question, what do you think is a good idea to help with this problem or this very large concern? And she said, well, to lessen the amount of sacro fishing. And we very much are in unison with that, because enough is enough. And there are so many elders and so many people that just really feel that we need to close down the sacro fishery. What do we have to lose but everything? The whales are not eating. Many of the different mammals and many of the different fish that are out there are starving. You don't do that to your children. And at some point I really hope that we're able to come together and work together. And I would just put it forward, just not for myself, but for what many of the elders in Sitka are saying. They're working with Fish and Game. There's these measurements, scientific measurements, but there's traditional knowledge. For time immemorial, the Tlingit people, the Haida people, and the Tsimshian people, we have got the brightest and the best scientists, biologists, astrologists, spiritual people, many people who have managed this for time immemorial. I hope what you can feel is our heart at this time. And I would just say thank you for your information and your presentation.
Thank you.
And I really, really hope that things go forward and we just really limit the sacro fishery, because one of the elders said, I'm older now, it's hard for me to walk, but I still have my voice. And he led us down a protest march right down Callahan Street. There's 18 of us, and he gave us 12-hour notice. Right, Andrew was right there with him too, going, let the herring spawn. But the point is, he said, what do we have to lose but everything? So I say that to you. That might be him falling right now. I say that to you humbly, and as an invitation and a challenge to work together, please, and really protect our herring and limit the sacro fishery that's taking place. Sheesh. Hi, Peter. Thank you so much. Thank you for our elders who are present today also.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Great.
you.
Great talk.
Thank you.